Well, thank you all for coming. I also like to thank, before I forget, both the Humanities Center and the Department of French and Italian for helping to sponsor this visit by Katie Chenoweth. We're very happy to have her here. We've been talking about this for a while and finally made it happen. So Katie Chenoweth specializes in Renaissance French studies. Her research and teaching interests include Renaissance print and media culture, the history of French language, deconstruction, early cinema, translation, and Montaigne's essays. She received her PhD in French Studies from Brown University. Before coming to Princeton in 2013, she taught at Washington and Lee and at the University of Chicago, where she was a Harper Schmidt Fellow in the Humanities. She's published articles on Montaigne, Derrida, sovereignty, and 16th century French language politics. Her current book project is The Prosthetic Tongue, Print Technology and the Uncanny Rise of the Vernacular in Renaissance France. She's also part of the annual workshop for the Derrida Seminars Translation Project, and she can tell you more about this. I think he's going to mention it in the lecture as well. Over the summer, she was in France at Derrida's home looking at his library for reasons that I may or may not be able to talk about, so I will leave that to her discretion. Just a somewhat personal, professional note, I'm always impressed with Katie and her work. She just taught my theory class on Derrida's work on Plato's Pharmacy, which has to be the most difficult thing in the anthology, I'm convinced. And she did it with grace, and my students came out understanding it in ways I'd never imagined that they could in about a 50-minute period. And I think that's the real sign of understanding something well, especially theory or anything really, that you can explain it, right? That when you reach that point when you can teach it. And so look forward to more of that today. Katie works on the hardest stuff in French in my mind, right? Derrida and Montaigne got to be the two hardest writers there are to read. And so I'm not going to waste more of your time talking about her. I'm going to turn the time over to Katie, who will present Derrida at Montaigne, A Stay of Execution. So please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that incredibly generous introduction. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so grateful for the invitation, and I'm thankful to the Derrida Reading Group for having me, and I look forward to more conversations. March 22nd, 2000 was a Wednesday. It was 2 days after the first day of spring. Jacques Derrida was teaching the final session of his regular seminar in Paris at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. He would soon be leaving Paris for Southern California, where he would repeat his seminar course at Irvine, as Matt knows, as he had done every spring since the late 1980s. This March 22nd, Derrida informed his students and others who filled the lecture hall in Paris that since seeing them the week before, he had paid a visit to the Chateau and Tower Library of Montaigne, located near Bordeaux in the Périgord region of France. This is where Montaigne lived and wrote. The name Montaigne comes from this estate, which was acquired by the philosopher's great-grandfather in 1477. So what you see here from the touristic website, the chateaumontaigne.com, you see the chateau here on the right, and on the left, you'll see the Tower Library, which is what I'm going to be talking about mostly today. So the Tower Library, which I'll be talking about especially in this first section of my talk, is where Montaigne composed his famous essays between 1571 and his death in 1592. While the rest of the chateau was burned and seriously damaged in the 19th century, the tower has been essentially preserved. It was built in the 14th century. Montaigne occupied it in the 16th century. So visitors, like Derrida in March of 2000, can see Montaigne's library on the third floor more or less as it was during the essayist's lifetime, although the hundreds of books that once lined these circular walls have been removed. Visitors will see an empty chair sitting at this desk right here, as if Montaigne had just stepped out. If they look up, they can see the 46 Latin and Greek inscriptions that Montaigne had painted on the ceiling beams, quotations culled from the library's own books. There are no attributions on the ceiling beams, but a canny humanist reader could recognize quotes from philosophers like Sextus Empiricus and Lucretius, playwrights like Euripides and Sophocles, lyric poets like Horace, lines from the Bible, especially Ecclesiastes and Paul's epistle to the Romans. These ceiling inscriptions transform the library space itself into a text, one not unlike the commonplace books that were popular in Renaissance Europe, in which readers would extract phrases from their readings and copy them out into their own notebooks, kind of reordering them, transplanting them into a new discursive context for their own use. The commonplace book resembles older genres like the anthology, which we still have today, of course, or the florilegium, a medieval genre, both compilations of excerpts whose etymologies, anthology, florilegium, both evoke a gathering of flowers. It's been suggested that Montaigne's essays themselves may well have begun their life as exactly this kind of gathering, as a commonplace book or a florilegium. And this might have been what Montaigne had in mind when he described his text as, quote, only a bunch of foreign flowers. In French, that's fleurs étrangères, right? Foreign or strange flowers. Providing of my own, he says in his text, providing of my own only the thread to tie them together. As a practitioner of quotation, Montaigne is persistent and passionate, sometimes unfaithful, and occasionally violent. His quotes are mostly in verse, as you see here, and almost all in Latin, although he occasionally cites in other languages, like Greek, Italian, French, or Gascon, the regional language in that part of France. Per Montaigne's indications to his publisher in 1588, the quotations, and this is what you're seeing here from a page of one of the essays, the quotations are set off from the main body of the text by a line break and placed in italics. So whereas modern editions of the essays impose paragraph breaks, which is more in keeping with our modern reading rhythms, in the 16th century editions, these citations were the only breaks in an otherwise solid body of text. In this way, they're the defining visual mark of the essays, like so many scars, revealing where the body has been cut, verse cutting prose, Latin cutting French, other authors cutting Montaigne. The beam inscriptions in the Tower Library thus come to look uncannily like the pages of the essays themselves. Or we could say the architecture of the page of the essays imitates the library beams where they're produced, right? Page and ceiling are, in any case, part of the same scene, the same practice of reading and writing. In a famous passage from the essays, Montaigne fully envelops one in the other, encircling and enframing the cutting practice of reading and writing within the tower walls. That's this quote. When I'm at home, I turn aside a little more often to my library, from which at one sweep I command a view of my household. There I leaf through now one book, now another, without order and without plan, by disconnected fragments. One moment I muse, another moment I set down or dictate, walking back and forth, these fancies of mine that you see here. It is on the third floor of a tower. In my library, I spend most of the days of my life and most of the hours of the day. Now, I think that John Florio's early 17th century translation of the essays captures even better Montaigne's French and the practice of reading and writing that he's describing here. There, without order, without method, and by piecemeals, I turn over and ransack, now one book, now another. So this third floor library is a place where texts are ransacked and unsewn. Décousu is the word that Montaigne uses, literally something de-sewn. The reading Montaigne does in the tower puts books to pieces. It unstitches their bindings, so that even prior to the cut and paste of citation, to read from Montaigne is already to cut into what Derrida will later call the integral body of the other text. To cite on the ceiling or on the page is to only make this cut visible. But as we can see, citation also cuts and puts into pieces one's own integral body as a body of text. Citation in this way marks a double cut constitutive of textuality. This double cut implies that there is in fact no such thing as an integral body when it comes to text, except maybe as a phantasm promised or deferred. The tower, a monolith from the outside, reveals itself to be divided up into floors, a site of inscription and movement of an interior walking. Montaigne tells us that the writing that happens there, that he does there, is just as piecemeal and ransacked as the reading. It's broken by starts and stops, by temporal interruptions and spatial comings and goings. The dictating voice echoes on the tower walls, disconnected from the writing hand. The idiom of the essays moves around the room. It skips from one book to another, in and out of languages and authors. It leaps from beam to beam. So on the website of the Château de Montaigne, the website I showed you earlier, prospective visitors are informed that, quote, Your guided visit of the tower is an invitation to walk in the footsteps of the famous philosopher. What I'll be looking at with you today is the way in which, following his visit to Montaigne, Derrida can be found treading in Montaigne's footsteps, retracing his path, following him back and forth in his library. This is a singular moment deserving of our attention for several reasons. Firstly, Montaigne as a philosopher does not preoccupy Derrida in the way that other figures from the history of Western philosophy do, like Hegel, Heidegger, Kant, or Plato. Montaigne as a writer does not preoccupy Derrida in the way that literary figures like Celan, Blanchot, Mallarmé, or even Shakespeare do. If Montaigne is a constant presence throughout Derrida's corpus, and I believe that he is, Matt and I are going to try and establish that he is, that presence is much subtler, much more elliptical or gestural, borne out in the form of quotation or imitation rather than confrontation or what is called deconstruction. The other major reason it's surprising to see Derrida turn to Montaigne here in this last session of the 1999-2000 seminar is that the topic that year was the death penalty. This subject does not appear in Montaigne's essays in any explicit fashion, especially compared with writers that Derrida's already brought into the seminar earlier that year, writers like Victor Hugo or Albert Camus, who are passionately anti-capital punishment and who participate in what Derrida calls the abolitionist discourse of literary modernity. It's weird to find Montaigne showing up in this last session of the essays. Montaigne, who lived and wrote before the question of capital punishment had even become a question as such. So what I'll be investigating today is this strange and fortuitous arrival of Montaigne at the midpoint of the 2-year death penalty seminar. So this is at the end of Volume 1, which is also the first year before the second year that would resume the following winter, and which is forthcoming from Galilei and University of Chicago Press. Maybe it's only a chance philosophical encounter occasioned by an act of tourism. Derrida tells us he was, quote, lucky enough to visit Montaigne's tower. J'ai eu la chance, he says. But maybe the very fortuitousness of this encounter, happening like Montaigne's own reading, without order, without method, opens up a future for the thinking of the death penalty that could not have been calculated in advance. Maybe, too, it will have something to tell us about Derrida, about Montaigne, maybe most of all about the kinds of lifelines that can exist between historical and theoretical moments, between towering texts and writer-philosophers, and about the kinds of calls for help or pardon that might be placed with urgency when life is on the line. But before we go climbing up into Montaigne's Tower Library with Derrida, I want to say just a few words about the seminars themselves and the death penalty seminar in particular. So here's a little bit of the backstory, briefly. Following Jacques Derrida's death in 2004, a decision was taken to publish his seminars. That is, the lecture courses that he delivered at the various institutions where he taught in France and the United States between 1959 and 2003. It's a long career. Because Derrida systematically wrote out his lectures in advance but did not publish them at all during his lifetime, the corpus of these seminars consists of some 14,000 pages or 43 volumes of wholly unpublished material. So this is a massive body of work that's unpublished. The complete edition of these seminars is now being undertaken, being edited and published at roughly the rate of 1 volume per year, in French first, and then in English. And so what you see here are the published volumes. Again, Édition Galilei in French and University of Chicago Press in English. So they're being published. The principle was that they would be published in reverse chronological order. So the first one that was published was the last seminar that Derrida gave during his lifetime, The Beast and the Sovereign. And then the most recent volume to appear in English is The Death Penalty. There's been a kind of strange leap backwards for reasons that I could go into in the Q&A if you're interested, to the 1964 Heidegger seminar in French. So that will actually be the next one to come out in English. So Derrida's seminars typically followed one theme over 12 to 15 weeks. Starting in the late 80s, Derrida gave his seminar in Paris in the winter before coming to the University of California, Irvine in April. We would give the same thing again in English in an improvised translation for an American audience. Very shortly after returning from Montaigne in March of 2000 then, Derrida would be leaving France for California to translate The Death Penalty. This itinerary is important because the United States and the American practice of capital punishment are a constant presence in this death penalty seminar. Even though it was first delivered to a French audience in Paris, the death penalty seminar reads as if it's always destined for America, for the West Coast, for Californian ears. The fact that California was among the US killing states did not escape Derrida's attention. California had in 2000 and still has today the largest population of death row inmates in the country. There are 742 people on California's death row, even though the legal status of the California death penalty has been called into question since 2006. I don't know if you know any of this backstory, but there was a moratorium placed in 2006 on the state death penalty, and it was very recently, on July 16th of this year, declared unconstitutional by a federal judge. So it's in this kind of state of suspension right now. The date of Derrida's itinerary is also worth noting. I've mentioned that this session was at the end of the 1999-2000 academic year. These years witnessed the high water mark for both the national death row population, as you see here, and executions in the US since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976. Derrida was aware of this, though he could not have known, of course, because he died in 2004, the extent to which the tide was turning. And yet his seminar does in some ways seem to forecast rather uncannily the current crisis surrounding lethal injection in the US. Derrida suggests that the modern history of the death penalty has been driven by what he calls an anesthesial logic, that is, a desire to reduce cruelty and suffering, and at the same time a disavowal of cruelty. Derrida recalls the Dr. Guillotin, the inventor of the guillotine, was a self-styled philanthropist who conceived of his invention as a humanitarian intervention that would produce the desired punishment painlessly and mechanically. What Derrida brings to light is that this very same impulse, the same one motivating the inventor of the guillotine, can be found on the side of abolitionists like Camus, who proposes this kind of strange compromise with the death penalty, in which the condemned person could freely, of his own volition, take his or her own life using sleeping pills or other drugs, sort of slipping off painlessly and imperceptibly into death. This anesthesial logic, the desire to eliminate cruelty and pain, thus falls on both sides of the death penalty debate. And for those who are just in the Plato's pharmacy class, this is the same doubleness of the pharmacon. It's the same reversibility of the pharmacon that Derrida is finding here again with anesthesia around the death penalty. This reversibility motivates, this anesthesial logic motivates both opposition to capital punishment and modern killing technologies, the apotheosis of which would be lethal injection, a cocktail of drugs that begins, as you might know, with an anesthetic, usually sodium pentothal. And this is, of course, the drug that's recently been in short supply in the United States, which has resulted in renewed scenes of suffering and, as some have suggested, unconstitutional levels of cruelty. This violation of the Eighth Amendment. Peggy Chenoweth, the English translator of the death penalty seminar, stated in a recent interview that, quote, the anesthesial logic Derrida identified in 1999 seems to be causing the U.S. death penalty to seize up and perhaps even to enter its death throes. So now back to Montaigne. On March 22, 2000, Derrida opened his seminar with a quote from Montaigne's essays. And so this is this giant block of text, and I wanted to show you what it looks like, and then we're going to be going through it piece by piece. There's this little kind of prologue about the question of survival and a reference to a paper or presentation that a student was going to be giving later on, the death penalty as theater of life, and then we hit the Montaigne. So just so that you have that in the back of your mind, and then we'll be going through it here. Derrida begins by offering up the quotation. Then he announces that it is a quotation, or citation in French, and I'll sort of go back and forth between those two terms. Then, commenting on his own act of quotation, Derrida immediately characterizes it as a ripping that is theatrical, and now he's already repeated it 3 times. Then it becomes a bit violent, as he admits to extracting the words from their body in order to better offer them up in pieces, rehashed and repeated for the benefit of the crowd gathered for this final session of the academic year. Now I'll just read through all of this. To espouse at the cost of his or her life. This is a quotation, to espouse at the cost of his or her life. I am dramatizing this quotation. I am theatricalizing it a little by ripping it from its page. To espouse at the cost of his or her life. And for French speakers or Montaigne aficionados in the room, the French is épouser au prix de la vie. So we see that the theatricality, the very theatricality of this citation is its violence. The source of the quotation remains anonymous for the moment. This could be any body dragged before the law. Montaigne's text, which we don't yet know is Montaigne's, has been rendered audible and visible through a cut. Yet the fullness of an act of citation remains suspended in this opening moment. In fact, the name of the author and the remembering of the textual body are the promise of this citational violence. We're waiting for a body and for a name. So we've seen this type of cut quoting before. It's Montaigne's own. If we can call own a quotation that disrupts any kind of identity of the text or textual property through its citational practice. So here Derrida is taking a page from Montaigne's book, so to speak, by literally taking a page from Montaigne's book, making pieces of Montaigne's essays in the style of Montaigne, in the style of his Tower library that he's just visited. It's a kind of hyperbolic invocation of Montaigne, even though the writer's name is withheld here. Even if we don't yet know it, we sense that we're on our way to Montaigne. Montaigne, Derrida will finally say, several pages later, interrupting his own discussion of Kant and Camus, Montaigne, from which I am returning and toward whom I will return. The original French here is equally weird, if not weirder, equivocating between the proper name of Montaigne as a site and a signature. And the French is Montaigne dont je reviens et vers lequel je reviendrai. The very name of Montaigne is cut here, cut and disseminated. And if Montaigne can be cut this way, it's because, as we now know, he is himself a splicer of books and languages. Derrida's theatrical violence here just repeats this library scene. We could even say that Derrida opens his seminar by inhabiting or being himself inhabited by this scene. Derrida is at Montaigne. He will finally affirm this several pages later as he quotes Montaigne once again. He says, "Since I'm at Montaigne, I'm going to stay a while. Puisque je suis à Montaigne, j'y reste un peu." In earlier sessions of the death penalty seminar, one has heard or read the history of prisoners' bodies being subjected to the theatricalization of punishment, bodies framed, timed, and sliced by the death penalty. In this final session, the body in question would seem to undergo a strange and almost vulgar process of substitution given the gravity of the subject matter. It becomes, in this scene, a body of text, Montaigne's body of text, which Derrida now makes a show of cutting for us with exacting timing and precision. The term citation in French, especially with the emphasis and the inflection that Derrida gives it here, recalls the summoning of a subject before the law. Here, Montaigne's cutting and dismembering practice of citation, as Derrida appropriates it, comes to resemble the action of the guillotine. Montaigne's tower is no longer just a scene of reading and writing, but one of law and punishment. The beams of the library would now seem to morph into a machinery of death dealing, the gallows, the gibbet, or the guillotine frame. To all appearances, then, citation would be on the side of death and of the death penalty. And yet, this opening citation follows, as we saw when we looked at the full block, follows the question of survival in the prologue. In fact, it seems to open up this question. What then does citation or quotation have to do with survival, or as Derrida calls it, survival, in the French survivre, that surplus of life that marks or exceeds it? If this cut of citation calls up the scene of the guillotine and the death penalty, in what way might it also at the same time be an affirmation of life, a yes cutting or a cut of survival? Now, the body as text metaphor is also Montaigne's, or we find it in Montaigne, with his famous characterization of his book as, quote, a book consubstantial with its author, member of my life. Livre consubstantiel à son auteur, membre de ma vie. Consubstantiality is, if you know anything about the history of the Reformation, a very charged notion in the context of the 16th century wars of religion. It's bound up in the Protestant challenge to the Catholic tenet of transubstantiation of the Eucharist. Montaigne was Catholic, or professed to be Catholic. Still, the essays stage what Derrida calls a hand-to-hand combat with Christianity. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the next few minutes. Perhaps it's not surprising, then, to find Montaigne's book secularizing and appropriating the Protestant doctrine of the body of Christ to designate his book as consubstantial with himself and his body, member of my life. this consubstantiality would not be flesh made word or vice versa, but in a much more dynamic metonymy, body and book merging or grafting onto one another to the point where the distinction between literal and figurative senses of a term like member or even life become difficult to separate. Or a term like de-circumcision, which we're going to see. Indeed, this promise of a name in Derrida's opening of the seminar, this convergence of cutting and naming, recall yet another scene, namely the ritual ceremony of circumcision in Judaism. When I summon to appear on stage the body of this entire sentence in the paragraph to which it belongs, you will see that it is a matter of religion, of circumcision, and even decircumcision. The text waiting to appear says, in fact, decircumcise oneself, to cause someone to espouse it at the cost of his or her life. I leave you to dream about this sentence fragment, more or less painfully stolen from its integral body. Now, circumcision traverses Derrida's work. It can be found in, among other texts, Glas, the Postcard, Archive Fever, Ulysses' Gramophone, and perhaps most prominently Shibboleth or Circumfession. In that last text, which he co-wrote with Geoffrey Bennington, Derrida discusses his own preoccupation with the topos of circumcision. At one point, he links circumcision to the figure of the guillotine. Speaking of his book, Glas, he says, Glas with its circumcisions, guillotines, incisions. He will also confess in Circumfession hyperbolically, but with a passionate, autobiographical, and even philological conviction, quote, circumcision, that's all I've ever talked about. Consider the discourse on the limit, margins, marches, etc., the closure, the ring, alliance, and gift, the sacrifice, the writing of the body, the pharmakos, excluded or cut off, the cutting, sewing, the blow, the sewing back up. He actually goes on and on. I won't keep going. He says, circumcision, it's that, without knowing it, never talking about it or talking about it in passing, as though it were an example. I was always speaking or having spoken. So I'll stop quoting that sentence there because it goes on literally 4 pages and hundreds of words. But I'll quote to give you a better sense of what circumcision means for Derrida. The excellent scholar John Caputo, who's written on Derrida and religion, he says that circumcision in Derrida's work is the cut that opens the word or the heart or the ear to the other, to the tout autre. So the tout autre in Derrida is any and every other person, other being, but it's also the wholly other, the tout autre, that which is entirely other. So circumcision ruptures the sphere of the same, it opens our heart. In this sense, Caputo says, deconstruction is circumcision, the cut that opens the space for the incoming of the tout autre. Circumcision is the cut that says yes. In the context of the death penalty seminar, we could see circumcision as an answer to the guillotine's blade. Not a punishing cut, but as Caputo says, a cut that says yes, the cut that opens the heart. But it's never so simple with circumcision, since this affirmation and opening to the other is also a mark on the body that determines exclusion or exclusivity. Like the notion of partage, it entails both participation and sharing, but also a setting off or setting apart. Right, so it's again that reversible figure. Even if it's what makes sharing possible, circumcision, this mark, cannot be shared. As Derrida insists elsewhere, it is each time unique. So Derrida announces plainly here that circumcision is at stake for him in the death penalty seminar, but not only because it's all he's ever talked about, but because it's already at stake for Montaigne, who, lest we forget, has still not been given his name at this point. Derrida lets us know that we will all be able to witness the ritual of naming later on when he uncuts Montaigne's text, when I summon to appear on stage the body of this entire sentence, etc. In fact, Montaigne does not only say decircumcise oneself, this strange term, he actually coins it or baptizes it. He says it for the first time. The few modern French dictionaries that actually include this term cite Montaigne's passage from the Essays, the same passage Derrida is talking about here, as the original usage. The first dictionary that recognized it was the 1872 Littré, which added this qualifying remark. Since circumcision is something physical that cannot be undone, to decircumcise and decircumcision are not good words. They're able to be taken only in a figurative sense. So, right, to decircumcise is not a good word because it can have no proper sense, no sense in the body. Once you're circumcised, there's no going back. But in the figurative sense, the term decircumcision has come to mean a forced act of conversion, especially of a Jew or Muslim to Christianity. And that's what the sense that Montaigne will give it. Derrida reminds us in the course of this seminar that such a conversion, in fact, marks Montaigne's own family history on the side of his mother. His mother, Antoinette de Loup de Villeneuve, most scholars now agree that she was descended from Marranos, Spanish Jews who came to southern France from Spain at the end of the 15th century after being forced to convert to Catholicism. So whether Montaigne was aware of this history on his mother's side, most scholars are still working to make sense of the references to Judaism in the essays and in Montaigne's travel journal, including the fact that he visited multiple synagogues in Italy and spent a day in Rome in the Jewish quarter, where he in fact went to witness a circumcision. Basically, Montaigne scholars agree we don't know what to do. We still don't know what to do about Montaigne's Jewish history or his Jewish influence. It is worth noting, though, that Derrida also identified himself with Marrano Jews. Hélène Cixous wrote of him that he is, quote, Derrida, one of those Jews without knowing it and without knowledge, a Jew without having it, without being it, a Jew whose ancestors are gone, cut off, as little Jewish as possible, the disinheritor, guardian of the book he doesn't know how to read. What we can say for now about Montaigne is that his own maternal lineage has been decircumcised in the sense that he gives it for the first time. So we find this term in the passage that Derrida finally cites near the end of this session of the seminar. This is Montaigne, quoted by Derrida. Any opinion is strong enough to cause someone to espouse it at the cost of his or her life. The first article in that fair oath that Greece swore and kept in the war against the Medes was that every man would rather exchange life for death than Persian laws for their own. In the wars of the Turks and the Greeks, how many men can be seen accepting the cruelest of deaths rather than decircumcise themselves in order to be baptized? This is an example that no religion is incapable of. Derrida reads in Montaigne here a skepticism toward religion, but also a hypothesis about religiosity or the religious as such. I quote Derrida here from page 279. He's introducing this passage. He says, Montaigne is speaking of all religions, not only the Christian religion. It is the essence of every religion. Every religion is capable of preferring something else to life at the cost of life. In other words, religion is or grants the surviving of survival. And Derrida concludes that for Montaigne, the religious of religion is always the acceptance of sacrificial death and the death penalty in the shadow of a surviving that is supposedly worth more than life. End quote. So what is decircumcision in this context? It would be the alternative to this surviving through sacrificial death. It's the conversion, the espousal of life at the cost of circumcision. It's the closing of the cut into a scar in order for life to continue. As for Montaigne, his own life was made possible, right? He's only alive through his mother's line precisely because such a decision, the decircumcision decision, was made. If Montaigne is alive, it's because he's uncut, whether he knows this or not. It's through his father's line, as we've seen, that Montaigne takes his name. And yet this is no simple filiation either, nothing simple with Montaigne. So the Montaigne family had a livre de raison, a family almanac, used to record events like baptisms, weddings, and deaths. For Derrida, dates and anniversaries are intimately tied to circumcision, as that which happens only once, only one time, and yet which must be repeated or readable to make their mark. In Shibboleth, a work that's dedicated to the poetry of Paul Celan, Derrida wrote of this equivocal nature of dates that, quote, they are only able to mark to the extent that their readability announces the possibility of a return. Right, and so this return is a kind of coming back. It's something that happens only one time, and yet at the same time it keeps returning. And so for this reason, Derrida will say a date is a specter, and he cites the calendar as the example of this spectrality. Right, you know, your birthday, you were only born once. This is an event that can never happen again. It can never come back, and yet every year it comes back anyway. Never quite the same, repeated. It only happened once, and yet it repeats. So this is exactly what we see. I know, I apologize, the image is a little blurry at this size. This is exactly what we see in the Livre de Raison. So you have every page is a day of the calendar, and we have important things that happened on those dates, and then what you do is you write in your own family events, births, baptisms, deaths. Here, this is noting that Montaigne was elected mayor of Bordeaux on a certain day, right? So you add those to this series of events that happened on that day, right? So each one is unique, and yet you have this repetition every year of the return of the date. So the reason I'm talking about this is on a page that I'd like to show you, but which I wasn't able to reproduce, Montaigne does something extremely interesting. In the entries for his father's birth and his own, we find that Montaigne has crossed out their family name, which was Ekem. How do you pronounce that, Bob? Do you say Ekem? I say Ekem. Okay. The patronymic name Ekem. He's crossed out the name of the father, leaving only the name de Montaigne, right, the name of this place. So first we saw Montaigne's maternal filiation ruptured by this necessity of conversion for the Murano Jews, an erasure of circumcision. Now the writer breaks that paternal line with a single strike-through and a name and a book and a calendar. He renames and rebaptizes his father and himself. We might also say circumcising or recircumcising them. Only one time, writes Derrida and Shibboleth, une seule fois, circumcision takes place only one time. Derrida, for his part, is not always able to remain faithful to Montaigne. He's not always able to follow his thread. He quotes a passage from the essay, A Custom of the Isle of Cea, a title that refers obliquely to suicide. And so here's Montaigne's quote, and then Derrida commenting on it. I'm not going to read all of this, but I will read the Montaigne quote. It comes to the same thing if a man puts an end to himself or passively suffers it, whether he runs to meet his last day or awaits it, wherever it comes from, it's always his. Wherever the thread may break, the whole thread is broken, the spindle is at an end, the fairest death is the one most willed. So he's speaking of suicide here. Derrida confesses in this passage that follows that he's fascinated by this figure, the figure of the thread breaking, which he's not sure he understands. Now, this classical commonplace would have been familiar and legible to Renaissance readers. The filet or thread in question is that of the morai. These are the fates who weave each person's life on a spindle and then bring it about with a cut. I don't know what Montaigne means, confesses Derrida, but precisely because this meaning eludes him, whether or not that confusion is bound up in the 400 years that separate Derrida and Montaigne, the 400 years of French language history that have severed the modern word for thread, fil, from the term Montaigne uses, filet, which means net in modern French, and whether or not this confusion is true or a feigned lapse, whatever the case may be, the confusion allows Derrida to take off with Montaigne's language. He sets it spinning, propelling us from the opening scene of Citation and theatrics and violence and circumcision into here a circus, where Citation becomes phantasm and cinema. Where Montaigne has more or less discernibly followed a recognizable thread of a classical trope, Derrida does not follow in kind. His own reading of Montaigne turns into a wild trapeze act, like the trapeze act he'll talk about here, in which we become scared for him, believing in his reading, but also knowing that he's playing a risky game, that his citation of Montaigne is both a thread and a cut. Here in the Tower Library, leaping after Montaigne, like Montaigne, from beam to beam, citing without a net. So to conclude, I'd like to look at a final sense that Derrida gives this name, Montaigne, namely, Montaigne is a time, une époque, before the death penalty has become a problem or question as such. So introducing the passage that we were just looking at, Derrida says, this passage, since I'm at Montaigne, I'm going to stay a while, confirms the idea that abolitionism, the idea that the death penalty was a problem, had not emerged at the time. It will await the Enlightenment. Further on, Derrida will insist again that Montaigne's text comes from, quote, a moment when the idea of condemning to death, the condemnation of death, had not really begun to surface. So to stay at Montaigne a while thus means, among other things, to take up residence within a kind of historical and philosophical suspension, une époque that is also the skeptical époque, a place where a moratorium is placed not on the death penalty, but on the very question of the death penalty, before Kant and others, before Camus, before Victor Hugo, at Montaigne, we may pause, meditate, disengage in this place where abolitionism is yet unthinkable. In an interview called Epoché and Faith, Derrida spoke of the skeptical epoché as, quote, the suspension of certainty, not of belief. The suspension, he affirms, is part of prayer. When I pray, says Derrida, it is very skeptical. I don't like this word skeptical, but it will have to do. The stay at Montaigne is, in this final instance, a skeptical prayer for the death penalty, and a prayer from Montaigne. Derrida tells us that while at the tower, quote, I felt a deep wave of inner compassion for him while meditating a few days ago next to what he no doubt loved the most, and reminds us that Montaigne, quote, kept a prayer stool in his bedroom, just beneath the library and above the chapel from which, when he was ill, he could hear the chanting of the Mass rising up to meet him. So if Derrida stays at Montaigne a while, it is less an apolitical shelter from the death penalty and its problems than a place from which to pray, to gather force, a place to call. Today, Derrida reminds us the chant or the song would be reached by way of telephone. Before, at the end of this session, placing the call to be militant, to, quote, militate for what is called the abolition of the death penalty. This is what has always been announced in the opening excision into Montaigne's text, a suspension of the question of capital punishment, just for a while, the time of a cut and a prayer and a quick call. At Montaigne, Derrida can profess a contingent ignorance. With Montaigne, he can say, que sais-je? What do I know? My final question for you is, what new or indeed very old abolitionism, or what is called abolitionism, what other form of non-oppositional opposition to the death penalty might appear on the horizon of this suspension? In order to respond to this question, I want to read with you a final passage from Montaigne's essays that Derrida does not quote. It's worth recalling before we look at this passage that prior to retiring to his tower life, Montaigne had a legal career that required him to pass judgments, make opinions, take legal decisions. Even after he began work on the essays, Montaigne continued to have an active, if somewhat reluctant, career as mayor of Bordeaux and mediator in the religious wars of 16th century France. In the chapter of the lame, des boiteux, Montaigne turns his skeptical attitude and his radical profession of ignorance to a juridical scene and brings it to bear explicitly on a case of capital punishment. Even if with Derrida, I must admit that what we're about to see still does not constitute an abolitionist discourse, I would say that it critically interrupts a certain practice of capital punishment by extending its timeline and rendering it incalculable. We find Montaigne discussing a case he saw with his own eyes as a 27-year-old law student. This famous case of imposture, or what we might now call identity theft, has remained in contemporary popular culture through the 1982 film The Return of Martin Guerre, also the film Summersby, if you've seen it, version of the same story, and also Natalie Zeman Davis's work of new social history, The Return of Martin Guerre. So here's the passage. In my youth, I saw the trial of a strange case which Corras, a counselor of Toulouse, had printed about two men who impersonated one another. I remember, and I remember nothing else, that he seemed to me, in describing the imposture of the man who he judged guilty, to make it so marvelous and so far surpassing our knowledge and his own, who was judge, that I found much rashness in the sentence that had condemned the man to be hanged. Let us accept some form of sentence which says, the court understands nothing of the matter, more freely and ingenuously than did the Areopagites, who, finding themselves hard-pressed by a case that they could not unravel, ordered the parties to come back in 100 years. So the suspension of capital punishment in lieu of hanging that Montaigne proposes, taking this case as an exemplum of all judgment, is a profession of ignorance. The court understands nothing of the matter. The case must be deferred. The parties must return in 100 years. This stay of execution, just long enough to extend beyond our allotted lifetimes, amounts to an indeterminate, if not infinite, deferral. The profession of ignorance slows and interrupts. It tranquilizes judgment while bodies and lives run their course. In this sense, I would suggest that abolitionism at Montaigne and Derrida's stay at Montaigne has the structure of an abolitionism to come, in the sense that Derrida gives this. It's an abolitionism still awaiting abolitionism. As Derrida writes elsewhere, the two of the to come wavers between the imperative injunction, a call or performative, and the patient perhaps of messianicity, a non-performative exposure to what comes, to what can always not come, or has already come. This patience might also be a capacity for survival alongside the patient death penalty, because abolitionism needs to be in it for the long haul. The to come is something like a prayer. I'll end with a quote from the end of this session as Derrida concludes his seminar and his stay at Montaigne, quote, "Let us harbor no illusion on this subject. Even when it will have been abolished, the death penalty will survive. It will have other lives in front of it and other lives to sink its teeth into." End quote. Thank you.